Hi there, I'm Dr. Jillian Bainard and I work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada out of the Swift Current Research and Development Centre in Saskatchewan. Thanks to the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association for inviting me to share with you a bit about my research and to provide this virtual update during this pandemic season. I hope everyone's doing well and thank you for taking the time to watch my talk. I just wanted to provide a bit of an update on the research I'm doing, which largely centers around the use of diverse cover crop mixtures as forage alternatives. There's been a lot of media attention. A lot of farmers are trying these methods of incorporating what might be typically considered a cover crop, which is a crop that would be simply harvested or would not be harvested for any purpose other than to be worked in the soil and increase sort of soil quality and can be used for a lot of other sort of ecosystem features, but which you would typically not actually remove. In a forage setting, we can still grow these cover crops, hopefully gain some of these advantages, but also gain the economic value of having a cover crop that can be consumed as forage for livestock. So you may be asking, well, what are some of these benefits? Suggested benefits are things like improved soil quality. So this might include things like water infiltration, aggregation, so making your soil stick together better, the ability of cover crops to control weeds depending on what species are included. A lot of these can outcompete weeds, and which can help in subsequent years. Ecosystem benefits, even if you have something with a lot of flowers, we can see increased pollinator visitation, etc. So in my research, we're trying to actually quantify some of these factors and see how they actually play out, in particular in the Canadian prairies, because these are not necessarily cheap crops to seed, depending on what you all put in there. And it can be a risk. So the more information we can provide as scientists, I think is really important. So today I just want to talk a little bit about general findings, and then I'm going to focus in on a couple updates from a few research projects that are currently underway. In regards to some of the general findings, we have found that as you increase diversity in a mixture, you can increase biomass productivity. However, this comes with a caveat that I don't think typically tons of species are going to give you any actual productivity benefit. I often get asked, so how many species and what species should I be including? For how many species, I think start with what you're comfortable with. I think maybe 4 to 6 species is a nice number to start with, and that's just kind of based on what I've seen and what I've talked to with other farmers. When you get a lot more species, you're going to be putting in a lot more effort, a lot more cost, and not necessarily for greater reward. In terms of what species to select, this is something that really you have to decide based on where you're farming, what your soil's like, what used to be growing on your site. And for this, I really suggest you work with the ministry representatives, ask your neighbors, see what types of things grow. What I do recommend in terms of species selection is that you hit a couple of key functional groups. Functional groups represent crops that would have different contributions to the system and also have different requirements in a system. So, for example, you might have cold season grasses or cool season grasses, just things like basic oats or barley, which you know have good productivity and good growth in your area. Legumes are an excellent thing to include, in particular for their ability to fix nitrogen. So things like peas. Hairy vetch is an annual that some people use. It can tend to be weedy, so that comes with a bit of caution. Clovers, there's a variety of different clovers and will have different success in different regions depending on where you're farming. The other group are things like brassicas. So this includes things like radishes, turnips. They tend to be really big above ground producers. A lot of that leafy material is very water. It's highly digestible by the animal. So you do need to be careful, and there can be some issues with toxicity. So you don't want to have a mixture that's really heavy on the brassicas. Brassicas do improve weed control. In particular, I've found that forage radish does really well at suppressing weeds in the season that it's grown, and probably a little bit into the following season as well. The fourth major group would be warm season grasses. So things like corn or millet or sorghum, again, will function differently in a mixture. Things like corn need a lot of space. So in a mixture, you're not going to get a huge amount of productivity out of them. So make sure it's not at a super high rate, or that would be probably a loss. But can again shift that grazing capability if you're going to graze that crop. And it does provide a decent amount of biomass, even if it's not its full potential, which will then contribute to that productivity as well. So those are some sort of general comments, and I just bring them up because that is something I'm often asked. From a research perspective, when we're looking at the soil components, this was going to take a little bit of time for us to really figure out, and I don't have a lot of data to present on that today, but we are collecting a lot of data that we are in the process of analyzing, and that does take a certain amount of time to get results from that, both just physically from the labs we send them to, but also functionally. It takes a lot of work to change soil, so we can definitely add organic material to the soil quite rapidly with a cover crop, and that's going to depend on how much of that cover crop you leave as residue and how much you remove as forage. And that kind of leads me into the first talk or subject I want to talk about here. A little bit of a research update is on a project that is funded by the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, which I'm very grateful for. And it started in 2018. What I wanted to look at was sort of best management practices for these polycultures. And remember, polyculture is just another word for these diverse annual forage mixtures. And again, in part because people are growing them, but they don't know, do I need to fertilize them? If this is supposed to be sort of a way to reduce my reliance on inputs, because I'm improving, soil nutrition, which I didn't really talk about yet, but the idea with the legumes, right, if they can fix nitrogen, we should be able to improve that soil fertility. Can I just drop fertilizer altogether? Or in terms of the weed control aspect, which I mentioned, if we can reduce our reliance on inputs, that's a really good thing, right? Both environmentally and importantly for farmers economically. So what this study was to look at was to kind of say, what factors can we control? And in particular in this one, the amount of residue we leave behind and the amount of fertilizer we apply. With these different mixtures, what kind of outcome do we get under these different scenarios? So in this experiment, we had a balanced mix that had 2 cool season grasses, 2 legumes, and 2 brassicas. I had a weed control mix that had 2 cool season grasses, 1 cool season grass, oats, 1 legume, peas, and then actually 3 different brassicas, so definitely higher on the proportion of brassicas, and then a nitrogen fixing mix, which was just 3 different legume species. I also had 3 fertilizer rates, no actual N applied, 60 pounds per acre, or 120 pounds per acre. And then the residue, there were also 3 levels. All of the residue left behind, which was 100%, half of the residue, which might be something you could do in a grazing situation, where you would, take half, leave half, and then a 0% residue if you sort of removed everything from the site and baled it for feed. And I've talked in other talks about how those different mixtures performed in that year, and the mixtures did respond differently to the fertilizer rates, and the nutritional quality of those mixtures also varied. What we find, I'll just comment briefly on nutrition while I'm thinking about it. When we use these mixtures, what we find, depending on what you include, you really can improve the forage quality of a forage mix. In particular, adding those legumes, you really can bump up that crude protein. The brassicas, you can also really increase digestibility, but keeping it in a good balance with those cool and warm season grasses to still have enough of that fiber present to actually provide some good lasting nutrition, right? That's not just going to run right through your cattle. So we did see shifts in these mixtures. Now, the other part of this study that I want to talk about now is to see what happens after we grow those mixtures. And in particular, because we're talking about fertility, today I want to talk a little bit about what happens to the crops we grow after having those mixtures. So in 2019, the following year to all those crop treatments, the whole site was seeded to wheat. And what we found, and you can see this in the figure that I've provided, is that the wheat yields didn't seem to change too much depending on what previous crop was grown, but they did change a lot based on how much residue was left behind. And I don't have this shown here, but in particular with the legume or the nitrogen fixing mix, the more residue we left behind, the greater impact we saw in a positive way on the following crop. And this is a really basic feature of cover crops, right? So if we grow this nitrogen-rich cover crop, leave it there, it breaks down into the soil and really can improve the following year's crop. We also saw the same with the fertilizer application. So 120 pounds of nitrogen in the previous year really did positively improve the wheat yield of that next year. So that was in 2019. And this is a simplified way. If you're really interested in this, please contact me and I can get more into the nitty-gritty with you. But just to kind of highlight this. This year in 2020, we were able to do some field work, although unfortunately with the pandemic, a lot of our plans had to change, but we were fortunate to be able to get some of our work accomplished. So what we decided to do is seed this whole site again, this time to peas. And this might again follow a typical crop rotation, right? Where you might have these mixtures. So we're talking an annual cropping system. Have these crop mixtures, grow wheat, and the next year peas might be a logical rotation to follow. Interestingly, this year, when we look at the actual the pea yield, and so this was like an agronomic pea, not a forage pea, what we see is those green bars in the figure really are all looking pretty similar. And the effects from 2018, those cropping treatments, are pretty much not apparent. Now, there could be various reasons for this, and there might be further legacy effects that we might see if we seed this again to another crop next year. But when we grow something like a legume, 2 years after growing those mixtures, we're really not seeing any appreciable difference anymore. So that's just something I wanted to highlight in terms of sort of a timeline idea of these studies. The last thing I want to talk about is the integrated crop livestock work that I'm doing, which is the next step in this cover cropping system where we actually now bring livestock onto the land. And this is gaining also a lot of interest in terms of working together with neighbors. You'll see BCRC has had a blog about this recently, and the idea that the resources that you have on your farm can be sort of supplemented with resources from a neighbor. So maybe you want to grow one of these diverse crops, but you don't have cattle to graze it, and you can team up with a neighbor, or vice versa. Maybe you don't have annual cropping land. You can work with a neighbor and bring your own cattle onto their land, and they get the benefits of this cover crop, and you get this diverse feed. And of course, if you have both on your own farm, what does that look like? So this project that I am talking about was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Beef Cattle Research Council, or BCRC. And so this was kind of a unique project where I had multiple sites in Swift Current, Outlook, Saskatchewan, Kelleher, Saskatchewan, and in Brookdale, Manitoba. My first comment is that the sites in Outlook and Brookdale, this was in 2019, we had a lot of problems with weed pressure, those were very dry springs and following a very dry 2018. So there were some just complications with getting stuff to grow and just tricky timing with rainfall events and pre-seed burn-offs. And so those two sites did not end up really growing properly. So we're going to try those again in 2021. So to the sites I do want to talk about are the ones in Swift Current and in Kelleher. Swift Current was right at our Agriculture Canada research farm. And in Kelleher, I was working with Dwayne Thompson at his ranch T2. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we did. So in both sites, we had an annual crop treatment. So that was just in, in 2019, I'm getting my years mixed up with peas. And then we had a simple mix, which was oats and peas, and a complex mix, which was oats, peas, barley, hairy vetch, tillage radish, Winfred brassica, which is a hybrid brassica, and then millet and something called phacelia, which has purple flowers. It's good for pollinators and also supposed to be good for soil aggregation. What we did is grew these in different paddocks in Swift Current and in different sections of the field at Dwayne's farm. In Swift Current, we grazed them with a small set of steers. So there was about 8 yearling steers we put on each paddock. A little bit about productivity there. We had about, for the dry matter production on the simple mix was just over 5,000 pounds per acre. So I'm just talking about Swift Current first. We got about 28 grazing days out of that mixture, but the steers were losing weight. So the simple mix, remember, was just oats and peas. On the complex mix, we got a little higher productivity, just over 5,500 pounds per acre, but the steers really didn't enjoy this mix, and they lost about 4 pounds per day on this mix. We did push the steers a bit because we could see there was still a lot of forage available, but that ended up our grazing days being about 39 days per acre. What we found though is later in the season, as we moved into September, the regrowth on those brassicas that the steers really didn't like in the complex mix in July and August, they really started eating them in September. So the weight loss was not near as much, and the cattle also started grazing that simple mix better, the regrowth of the oats and peas, and they started gaining weight, about 1.5 pounds per day. On Dwayne's farm, totally different system. Dwayne mob grazes about 1,100 cow-calf pairs and bulls. So we ran them all together on about 25 acres, half of which was the simple mix, half of which was the complex mix. The cattle, when they first came on the site, first I should say the simple mix dry matter production in Kelleher was over 6,300 pounds per acre, and the complex dry matter production was over 8,300 pounds per acre. So good productivity there. When the cattle came onto the site, they did preferentially graze the simple mix first, probably just more what they were familiar with. But then the longer they were there, they just ate everything down, and we had a good amount of trampling. With this number of cattle, we were actually left them there on those mixtures for a full 2 days, which resulted in about 92 grazing days. So that was really substantial, and like really did well. Dwayne was very pleased. What I want to just quickly show before I wrap up here is now what happened in 2020. So those 2019 sites, what we can say is if you got fussy steers that aren't familiar with different forage, you might be running into a little bit of an issue in terms of weight gain. When you're running more animals who maybe are used to different types of forage, you might get a lot better grazing potential out of these crops. I'm interested now in what happens after the fact. So in 2020, this year, on both sites in Swift Current and in Kelleher, we grew a forage barley. So something that, again, might be a typical thing to follow in a rotation. And in Swift Current, we didn't apply any fertilizer. At T2, Dwayne did apply 65 pounds of nitrogen and 25 pounds of phosphorus. What we see in the barley production this year, and if you want to look at the figure I've provided, the barley production was actually highest on the annual crop, so on the peas. And this probably is because of that residual nitrogen that's being left by those peas because we didn't apply any fertilizer. What you do see though is there's very little difference in the productivity of barley between the complex mix and the simple mix. And we also aren't seeing an impact of if it was grazed or not. We're really hoping to see the impact of a grazed site having more manure, more urea, so there'd be more nutrients going into the soil, more trampling that might have helped bring those plants into the soil a little more, and we're not seeing that here. In Kelleher, because Dwayne applied fertilizer, we don't see really any significant difference between the production of the barley crop that was grown on the annual crop of peas or on the complex mix or the simple mix. In the simple mix, we are potentially, I haven't run the stats on this yet, potentially seeing a little bit of an improvement in the grazed, the production of the crop, the barley crop where it was grazed versus where it was not grazed. But it's not a super strong effect at this point. So we are excited to share these results. Clearly we need more information on, and we're waiting to get that back now on all the soil data and to figure out what was really going on there. But I think this is a good start to show that some of these really great things that we were thinking might happen right away are not necessarily apparent, and we will be moving forward to see what happens again in another year, and hopefully we can do this another cycle and at additional sites, as I mentioned. So hopefully that brings you up to speed a little bit on what we're doing here at AAFC. I really value hearing from producers and from industry, so please reach out. I've provided my email address as well as my cell phone number because I am working remotely during this time. So I look forward to hearing from you. And thanks again for the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association for having me present. Thanks.